There's something dangerous about impatience. It whispers in your ear, "You've waited long enough. It's time to make something happen." But let me warn you, moving without God is moving into a storm you weren't built to handle. There's something about impatience that can wreck a destiny before it ever reaches its full potential. It pushes you into decisions you're not ready for, relationships that were never meant for you, and opportunities that look good but aren't aligned with God's purpose for your life. Impatience whispers that you're wasting time, that God is taking too long, that if you don't act now, you'll miss your chance. But what it doesn't tell you is that rushing ahead of God can cause more damage than the waiting ever could. Look at the story of Saul. He was anointed, chosen, called by God. But his downfall wasn't a lack of strength or ability, it was impatience. When Samuel delayed in coming to offer the sacrifice, Saul took matters into his own hands. He stepped out of alignment with God's instruction, and in doing so, he lost his kingdom. His impatience cost him everything. It wasn't that he wasn't meant to be king. It wasn't that God didn't have a plan for him. It was that he couldn't wait. And because he couldn't wait, he lost what was meant to be his. How many times have we done the same thing? God gives us a promise, but when it doesn't happen on our schedule, we try to force it. We manipulate situations. We chase after things that were never meant for us. And then we wonder why we're drained, discouraged, and stuck in cycles of frustration. Moving ahead of God's timing won't just slow you down, it can detour you for years. Some of us are still trying to recover from choices we made in a hurry, relationships we entered into too fast, jobs we accepted without praying, moves we made because we were tired of waiting. And now we're paying for a decision that could have been avoided if we had just trusted that God knew what he was doing. There is no blessing in what God has not ordained. You can strive, you can push, you can try to make things happen in your own strength, but if it's not in God's timing, it won't produce lasting fruit. That's why so many people reach what they thought was their breakthrough, only to find it wasn't what they expected. Because when you force something before it's time, it doesn't have the foundation to sustain you. What God has for you requires preparation. It requires process. It requires patience. God is not withholding from you. He is protecting you. He sees what you cannot see. He knows what you do not know. What you think is a delay is actually a divine setup. He is preparing the right people, the right opportunities, and the right environment so that when you step into what he has for you, you won't have to strive to keep it. If you wait on him, you won't have to fight to make it work. It will flow. It will be established. It will be blessed. But if you run ahead of him, you risk losing what he was preparing for you all along. There is no flaw in the way God orchestrates time. He is never early, never late, but always right on schedule. The problem is we don't always agree with his schedule. We look at our lives and measure time by human standards, by age, by seasons, by societal expectations. We compare ourselves to others, wondering why they seem to be advancing while we feel stuck. But what we fail to realize is that God is not bound by our clocks. He moves according to his divine plan. And when he moves, everything aligns in a way that no human effort could ever accomplish. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream of leadership, of authority, of influence. But after receiving that vision, Joseph didn't step straight into his destiny. Instead, he was betrayed, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From the outside, it looked like his life was going in the opposite direction of what God had promised. If Joseph had judged his future by his circumstances, he would have given up. But what he didn't see was that every delay was a setup for something greater. Had he gone straight from the dream to the throne, he wouldn't have had the wisdom, the strength, or the resilience needed to carry the weight of what God had for him. The delays weren't denials, they were divine preparations. This is where many people miss it. We assume that because things aren't happening on our timeline, they're not happening at all. We pray for open doors, and when they don't open fast enough, we start knocking down walls ourselves. But anything we build outside of God's timing, we will have to maintain in our own strength. And that's a weight we were never meant to carry. The blessing is in His timing, not ours. God sees the full picture. He knows what needs to be in place before you arrive. Sometimes the delay isn't about you at all. It's about the people and circumstances around you that need to be positioned correctly. If you step into something prematurely, it won't be ready to sustain you. Imagine baking a cake and pulling it out of the oven before it's fully cooked. It might look good on the outside, but when you cut into it, it's not solid. That's what happens when you rush God's process. It might look like the right time, but if God hasn't said move, then there is something still being worked out behind the scenes. God's timing doesn't just bring the blessing, it brings the peace to enjoy the blessing. When He says now is the time, you won't have to manipulate, force, or beg things to happen. Doors will open that no man can shut. Favor will rest on you in a way that human effort could never achieve. And when you finally walk into what He has prepared, you'll realize that the wait wasn't a waste, it was the foundation for the promise. Waiting is more than just a passive state of inaction. It's an active expression of faith, a decision to trust God, even when everything around you seems uncertain. Too often we view waiting as a burden, as time that could be spent doing something more productive or pressing. But in reality, waiting is one of the most profound demonstrations of trust we can show. It requires surrender, belief, and a willingness to rest in the confidence that God knows exactly what He's doing, even when we can't see the whole picture. When we wait, we're declaring that we believe God is working on our behalf. Waiting is saying, I know I'm not in control, but I trust the one who is. It's an acknowledgement that there is a purpose in the pause, and in that pause, God is preparing us for what's to come. We often think of faith as the big leaps, the bold moves of action. But faith isn't just in the steps we take. Sometimes faith is in the standing still. It's in the quiet moments when we don't understand, but we trust that God's plan is unfolding, even if it's not visible yet. Think about Abraham. God gave him a promise that he would be the father of many nations. But Abraham had to wait for years, decades even, before seeing the fulfillment of that promise. During that time, it would have been easy to doubt, to question whether the promise was even real. But Abraham's faith wasn't just in the initial calling, it was in the waiting. He had to believe day after day that what God had spoken would come to pass, and it did. But that waiting period was more than just a waiting game. It was a time of refining Abraham's faith, of building in him the trust that would be required to carry the weight of the promise. When we wait, we surrender our timelines. We give up the need to have everything figured out on our own terms. We stop trying to control the situation and instead rest in the knowledge that God's plan is bigger, better, and more perfect than anything we could orchestrate. Waiting forces us to confront our insecurities and fears. It challenges our sense of control and reminds us that we are not the ones driving this ship. But as we surrender, our faith grows. Each day we wait is an opportunity to build that muscle of trust and confidence in God's sovereignty. Waiting also reveals the strength of our faith. It's easy to have faith when things are moving quickly, when doors are opening, when the blessings are flowing, but true faith is tested in the quiet seasons. It's tested when nothing seems to be happening, when the promise feels distant, and when every step forward feels like a struggle. It's in those moments of waiting that God's refining fire does its deepest work. It purges impatience, doubt, and self-reliance, replacing them with the perseverance and peace that come from knowing that in His time, everything will be made right. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. It means preparing yourself, aligning your heart with God's will, and trusting that the timing will be perfect. Waiting is not wasted. It's building the foundation for what's to come. The patience you cultivate in the waiting will equip you to carry the promise when it arrives. So don't rush through this season. Let it strengthen your faith. Let it deepen your trust. Let it appeal, because waiting is not just about what God will do, it's about who you'll become in the process.
There's a certain kind of frustration that comes when we try to move forward without God's guidance. It's like trying to drive a car without knowing the destination. No matter how fast you go or how much energy you put into it, you'll eventually find yourself lost, running in circles, or stuck at a dead end. Moving without God isn't just inefficient, it's spiritually exhausting. When you're disconnected from God's direction, your efforts are like spinning your wheels in the mud. You might see temporary progress, but it's never lasting, and you'll soon find that you're more drained than before. When you attempt to go ahead of God, you end up fighting against forces that you were never meant to fight. You wrestle with circumstances, relationships, and situations that were never meant to be a battle for you. It's easy to think that by moving quickly and pushing forward, you'll make things happen. You might get the job, start the business, or enter the relationship, but if it's not God's will, you'll find that it comes with more burdens than blessings. It's like walking into a house that looks beautiful on the outside, but has no foundation. It looks promising at first, but soon the cracks start to show. I've seen people throw themselves into things with passion and zeal, thinking they're doing the right thing, only to realize later that they were never meant to be in that situation at all. The frustration of going against God's plan is that it's not just external, it becomes internal. You begin to feel a disconnect, a gnawing sense that something is off. No matter how hard you try, there's a void you can't fill, a longing you can't satisfy because your steps are out of alignment with God's will. The frustration becomes a cycle, and no matter how hard you work to break free, you find yourself going in circles. When we rush ahead, we assume we know what's best for us. We believe that our plans are more urgent, more pressing, or more important than God's. But moving without God is a form of self-reliance that often leads to destruction. It's like trying to build a house without blueprints. You might get something that looks like a house, but when the storms come, it won't stand. The foundation won't hold. And so many people spend years building lives, businesses, and relationships without asking God for direction. They use their strength, their intellect, their resources. But when the pressure rises, their structures collapse. We often make decisions based on what we see or what feels right in the moment, but God sees beyond the surface. He understands the full scope of the situation, the long-term consequences, and the best path forward. When we move ahead of Him, we bypass His wisdom and set ourselves up for frustration. That's why it's so important to not just move when we feel like it, but to move when God says go. If you're feeling frustrated, if everything you touch seems to be falling apart, it might be time to take a step back and ask yourself, did I consult God? Am I moving in His timing or my own? When you move without God, you're essentially stepping into a battle without the armor you need to win. You're heading into the fight unprepared and unsupported. But when you wait for God's timing, when you move in His direction, there's peace, even in the struggle, because you know that He's already gone before you. Waiting isn't a passive experience, it's an active one. While you're in the waiting room of life, it may feel like nothing is happening, like you're stuck in place or moving nowhere fast, but in reality, God is always at work, even in the seasons of waiting. What looks like inactivity to us is actually a time of preparation, a time when God is doing things in your life that you cannot yet see, laying the foundation for what is to come. Think about a seed planted in the ground. The seed doesn't know what's happening beneath the surface, but there's a process taking place that's unseen to the naked eye. Roots are growing deep. The seed is being prepared to break through the soil and rise to the surface. If you pull the seed out too early, you disrupt the process, and it will never grow into what it was meant to be. This is what happens when we try to rush God's timing. We disrupt the preparation process. We're not ready for what we're asking for because we haven't been shaped for it yet. When we're waiting, God is working on our character, our mindset, and our hearts. He's strengthening us in ways we don't understand. In the waiting, He's teaching us patience, humility, and perseverance. He's purging us of old habits, refining our motives, and helping us align with His will so that we can handle the blessing He's preparing for us. The delay isn't because God has forgotten you or is punishing you. It's because He loves you too much to let you step into something you're not ready for. If you rush ahead of God's timing, you'll find yourself unprepared for what you thought you were ready to handle. It's easy to focus on the destination and forget that the journey is just as important. God is not just preparing the blessing, He's preparing you. In the waiting, He is refining your strength and building your endurance. He's shaping your faith and your capacity to trust Him in the unknown. The challenges you face while waiting are not setbacks. They are the training grounds for your destiny. Sometimes we get frustrated with the waiting because we don't see what's happening behind the scenes. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. God is at work in your heart, molding you into the person who can carry the weight of what He has prepared for you. If He gave you the promise too soon, you wouldn't have the spiritual muscle to sustain it. It's in the waiting that God is doing His deepest work, building you into someone who can stand firm when the blessing finally comes. Waiting also deepens our relationship with God. When you're in a season of waiting, you learn to rely on Him more than you rely on your own strength. You learn that you can't control everything, and you find peace in surrendering to His will. This season is not just about getting what you want, it's about growing in intimacy with the one who holds your future. As you wait, you learn to trust God more fully, to lean into His presence, and to rest in the assurance that He is always working on your behalf, even when you don't see it. God doesn't waste time. Every moment of your waiting is filled with purpose. So when you feel like nothing is happening, know that God is preparing you for what He's about to do. Your season of waiting is a preparation for the blessing, the breakthrough, and the purpose that is ahead. Don't rush the process. Trust that God is working, and when the time is right, He will bring everything into fruition. When God moves, everything changes. There is a shift in the atmosphere, a divine alignment that no one can stop. The force of His will is unstoppable, and when He decides it's time for His purpose to unfold, nothing can hinder it. You may face opposition, resistance, or delays, but when God moves, His power overrides all obstacles. What He has ordained will come to pass regardless of what stands in the way. Think about the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army, the most powerful in the world at that time, stood between them and their freedom. There was no way out, no visible path forward. But when God said, move, He parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground. The waters that had once seemed like an impenetrable barrier became nothing but a pathway to their destiny. No army, no circumstance, no situation could stop what God had already spoken. what seemed impossible to man became an undeniable display of divine power. When God moves, he doesn't need permission from anyone. He doesn't need your approval or your understanding. He doesn't need things to look perfect, and he certainly doesn't need things to make sense to you. His will is sovereign, and when he says it's time, he begins to move in ways that are beyond human comprehension. The doors that were closed suddenly swing wide open. The hearts of those who once opposed you are softened. The enemy that has been chasing you finds itself powerless to stop you. We see this truth throughout the Bible. When God decides to act, nothing can thwart his plan. Look at King David. God had anointed him to be king, but David had to wait for the appointed time. He spent years in hiding, running from King Saul, who wanted to kill him. Saul had the power, the position, and the resources, but David had God's favor. And when the time came for David to take the throne, nothing could stop it. Saul tried to kill him, but God protected him. He moved on David's behalf in ways Saul couldn't even understand. When God moved, the plans of Saul and all his might were rendered powerless. When God moves, it doesn't matter who is standing in your way. It doesn't matter how powerful they seem or how formidable their position. His purpose will prevail. There is no force, whether in the natural or the spiritual realm, that can halt God's will. That's why it's important not to fear the obstacles or the opposition you face. When you're walking in the favor of God, nothing can keep you from your destiny. You may face setbacks, but those setbacks are simply setups for God to show his might. Sometimes we feel like we're waiting for something to happen, and we wonder why things aren't moving forward. But understand this, God is never late. He doesn't move when we expect him to move. He moves when the time is perfect. When he moves, he makes all things right, even when it seems like the situation is out of control. And when he does, there's no force in this world or the next that can stand against it. When God moves, chains are broken, mountains are moved, and impossible situations turn around. No person, no force, no setback can undo what God has set in motion. He moves with precision, with purpose, and with power. So rest assured, when God decides it's time, there is nothing and no one that can stop it.